everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Oh, it's a bit loud. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Afua Hirsch. I'm the Social Affairs and Education Editor at Sky News. I think it's the latter part of my title that makes most sense as to why I actually know both parts, because I look at what's happening in society and what's going on in the education system, I guess, both of which are relevant. So I'm really looking forward to the session this morning about Made in Britain and what needs to be done to address the skills gap so that we can revive manufacturing in this country. And I think that we will be taking quite a broad interpretation of manufacturing, but I'll let my panellists elaborate more on that, don't want to steal their thunder. So each of our speakers will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll open up to the floor. So please think of questions as everyone's speaking, so we can have a really good debate afterwards. I'll just introduce my panel. To my right is Jonathan Simons, who I'm sure many of you recognise as the head of the education unit at Policy Exchange, where he directs research on all aspects of education, including early years, school skills, and HE, and we rely quite heavily on all those aspects of his job at Sky News. Before joining Policy Exchange, Jonathan worked at Serco Group, where he was Director of Strategy and Market Development in the company's specialist education and health practices. And before that, he was Head of Open Public Services in the Cabinet Office. He's also the Chair of Governors and co-founder of Greenwich Free School, and Vice Chair of Governors of one of his local schools, and a trustee of WWV, a small charity that promotes volunteering among school children and other groups, including ex-offenders. At the end is to my right, Andy Westwood, Chief Executive of Guild HE, one of 2 formal representative bodies for higher education in the UK, and he was previously Head of Policy at the Work Foundation and Director of the Centre for Economic and Social Inclusion. He came to Guild HE from Whitehall, where he spent 5 years as a Special Advisor to Ministers in the Treasury Department for Innovation, Universities and Skills, and the Department for Communities and Local Government. To my left is Adrian, who's I've got to find, Adrian Bailey, Labour Member of Parliament for West Bromwich West. In his role as Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee Chair, Adrian has stressed the need for an improved model for financing SMEs. He's argued that credit union support for SMEs, which is common in the US, could help businesses in the UK. Adrian is also a member of the Liaison Select Committee and Joint Committee on National Security Strategy. Next to Adrian is Gavin Paul, who joined Clear East, who's sponsoring this event, following 4 years at the Centre for Social Justice, a political think tank for social regeneration. And he was the strategy director and then the executive director. And before that, he served in the Royal Air Force for 23 years as an aeronautical engineer before leaving in 2008. So good to have an engineer on the panel today. He was a wing commander and an advisor to the Under-Secretary of State for Defence and the Minister for Veterans in the last government, and he has extensive experience in strategic planning, operations, organisational reform, change management, and the implementation policy. Just look forward to hearing from him. And then finally, I'm delighted to have Simon Milner from Facebook. He is Facebook's Director of Policy for the Middle East and Africa, and he's responsible for representing Facebook on issues such as privacy, safety, security, and internet access. He joined the company in January 2012. He's a board member for the UK Council on Child Internet Safety and the Family Online Safety Institute, and is a non-executive director of the Tinder Foundation. So that's our panel. I'm sure you'll agree, an eminently qualified and interesting panel to discuss this issue. And we will go starting on my left with Adrian. We've got 5 to 7 minutes to speak, and then we will go down that way and then that way. So thank you, everybody. I am going to enforce timing, so please stick to your, and you might get a little note.
I was going to say, if you can give me a 1-minute nudge, that would be very helpful.
Try to be subtle.
Right, thanks very much. And I suppose I'd better start with the caveat or health warning that whatever I may say is my personal views. They reflect the research and evidence we've gathered as a select committee They are certainly not government policy, and they're probably not Labour Party policy. But I can assure you that I will leave no stone unturned in order to get in a Labour Party policy at some time in the near future. But it does reflect the sort of evidence that we have been gathering over 5 years, over a number of inquiries that we've had. And I'd like to actually start it at the very basics. I mean, the government invests billions of pounds into education at all levels, and yet we have a well understood but unfortunately not adequately addressed problem in skills. We're investing all this money, and yet we have very high youth unemployment, and we have a genuinely incoherent skills match in this country. There is an acute shortage of STEM-related subjects being taken, and a massive shortage in engineering and design, and certainly some computer skills as well. And you've got to look at it, the education process as a whole, and think, how can I change it? My complaint about the government, and to a certain extent, I'm not blaming any political party here, because you have a problem that spans right across a whole series of departments, and there isn't the level of focus and mutual working between the departments which will actually address the problems. Changing this means changing culture within our education system, and indeed our society as a whole. It means starting with primary schools and parents to ensure that the current bias towards what we call academic qualifications and moving on to higher education is rectified, to ensure that vocational training and, if you like, work and business related education is given equal status. At the moment it doesn't, and it's parents who want their children to go to university, teachers who are monitored and evaluated on their basis of getting children through academic exams and into university. And then over and above that we have a career advice service, which actually is almost reaching the point where it's a joke, quite frankly. So you start with the parents, and you start with the primary schools. You have to change the focus in schools, and you also have to change their attitude towards business and manufacturing in particular. And there are a number of strands which I think are necessary for government departments to tie together, but we're a long way from it at the moment. The first is to improve relations between business and education. That actually is happening sporadically across the country. There is a need there. And there are some very good examples of business trade associations working with schools to highlight the alternatives that are there for young people in business. It also involves changing the culture in schools so that school teachers have far greater awareness of the benefits of vocational education, and that vocational education should not be seen as an alternative to an academic education. And one of the recommendations that my select committee put in our report on apprentices is that schools should be evaluated and monitored on the number of students they get into vocational education and just not into higher education. At the end of the day, you can't blame teachers for actually performing to an agenda which they have not set themselves and which has been set for them. It needs a change in careers advice, which, as I earlier described, is just totally inadequate. Careers advice should be recognised as a highly professional and skilled occupation, because wrong skilled advice can divert talented people into blind avenues or whatever for the rest of their life, and it profoundly affects them, but also profoundly affects the economy of the country. And that means people with a far greater awareness of the different potential for young people to go into occupations that they currently don't seem to do so. But it also involves more than that. It also involves universities and working with business, and business working with schools in what I believe to be a triangular relationship to ensure that those people who go into vocational education may do via a business, but actually have the potential to get into university themselves. And by doing so, you enhance the role of maybe manufacturing business, maybe other businesses as well, in terms of status and a career opportunity, in order to develop local educational ecosystems which will be far more tailored to meeting local schools' needs than they are at the moment. I could say a lot more, but in order to keep in the good books of the chair the event, I'll terminate at that point.
I'm sure we'll pick up on some of those points in the discussion. Interesting that you end up with local ecosystems, and I'm sure there will be some thoughts about whether evolution, dare I bring that word into this session as well, or more autonomy for citizens. Local authorities might be a relevant part of that. But moving swiftly on, I'll come to Gavin now. So Gavin, that's it from you.
Okay, so local ecosystems is a good place to start, actually, because it sets out this of why, what are we doing, why we're here. We sponsored this event mainly because we stumbled into something which we didn't really expect when we were doing development. I'm responsible for a company doing a major redevelopment on Olympic Park under the tagline of Olympic Legacy. It's an economic powerhouse. It's taking 3 buildings and converting them into a technology-based campus with university and research studios, data centres, innovation centre, design centres, office space, a very creative environment with 12 event spaces. And we set a very strategic vision against that, which was mapped out against the legacy programme for the Games. That was education, employment, enterprise and the environment, so the 4 E's we called it. But it was very much about exploiting the characteristics of the buildings which broadcast Olympic Games to the world, therefore had a fibre network to guide for, connected straight into the viewing points in the World Wide Web on the roof. An amazing data centre which we're putting in there, and 42 megawatts of power, which is a bit techy, but actually in London at the moment there's a massive shortage of power, and we've already got 42 megawatts secure, which is great for what we're trying to achieve there. So we set off on our path to deliver the vision, exploiting what we see going on in East London around the whole of the explosion of growth in the technology-based sector and digital enterprise, and create a space which reflected that. And we've got a very, very creative design, very creative environment based around campus methodologies which we see out on the West Coast and other areas around the world. But what we started to come across was, there's a lot of software. We have Facebook here on my left, so we have a lot of Facebook and algorithms being developed, we have a lot of platforms being developed, and the tech explosions across London, whether it's in EdTech or FinTech or MedTech or whatever else tech is out there, is very much about coding. And you've seen a lurch in the curriculum with coding now introduced at school for 5-year-olds, which is horrific because I have a 5-year-old who's now I've got to brush up my coding skills from many years ago at university. But what we also stumbled into was the design aspect of it. The focus on STEM, the focus on coding, the explosion of growth in digital markets actually needs something to base itself in. So you pick up your phone, if you've got an Apple phone, you see it's designed in California and made in China, assembled in China. And what we started to see is, well, we've got designers, but actually we need some prototyping, we need some way of manufacturing. And we were struggling to find those places in London, because that's where we're based at the moment. But then we started to look further afield, and we started to realise that there's a skills shortage and a manufacturing-based shortage Yes, we've got the large companies, we've got the Jaguar Land Rovers, the Caterpillars, the JCBs, the AE Systems from my old defence world out there. But the small-scale industries, which actually support prototyping and manufacturing, are not there. And with the explosions of new technology, 3D printing, laser cutting, CNC milling and machining, you see there's new technologies. I was doing that when I was 16, it's slightly refined now. They are really on decline. And they actually need to be on the rise. They need to be on the rise because they need to be able to respond to what we're seeing in the technology-based sector, to be able to design and manufacture the products within which the other companies are designing software platforms to suit them. And we started to look around saying, okay, what do we need to do? What do we need to do to help that? Well, our programs, what we're doing in Near East is we want to partner with schools, partner with organisations, partner with our tenants, plus also other industries around us, to make sure we can promote skills and support skills growth through third-party activity. What we also want to do is join the dots. So Olympic Legacy is really not just about what's going on in the East End of London, which is a great place to start a company. But it's actually about joining the dots. Where else in the country are these hubs of manufacturing? Where is the opportunity for small-scale, what I call mom-and-pop factories of 10 to 20 employees sitting on an industrial park somewhere outside Sheffield or Rotherham or Wisbech or Kingsley or Bristol, and actually respond to the requirement that some of these companies need the opportunity and need facilities to go and manufacture and prototype components and products. 3 companies we're talking to are relocating to here east to fulfill that requirement. The companies will start and develop the prototypes and then have that product made. Actually, has subsidiary companies based in China. But over the last 5 years, they've seen a reversal. 95% of the equipment was being manufactured in China and shipped back to Europe. And now, because of the rise of the middle classes and the rise of consumerism in China, 5% is coming back our way. 95% is being sold into the internal market. So we need to respond to that. But there's a real requirement in this country. There's an appetite for it. The companies that we're talking to in the East are actually demanding it, saying we need a place we can prototype. So that is why we've gone on this journey from developing a tech cluster to deliver Olympic Legacy, based in East London, exploiting what we see in the creative industries, but actually ended up full circle to where I started my career back in engineering, saying we need to be able to manufacture and prototype to be able to take things to market. And I'll hand over, and I'm sure that will stimulate quite a few discussions and questions.
Thank you very much, Gavin. And Simon, I think you hopefully follow on nicely from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Yesterday when I got here, I went to our stand in the main hall. I hope you visited it. If you haven't, please do. The team there said the most common question they got was, why is Facebook at the Labour Party conference? And I suspect that many of you may be wondering, why is Facebook on this platform as well? And I'd say it's mainly because we're an engineering company. That's how we think of ourselves. The engineers are by far the biggest workforce in our company, and they focus on building and shipping product. That's what we do, and I think in many ways we resemble some of the companies that you might think of as the big engineering companies of this world. We're absolutely about making things and shipping them to the world, and we've grown pretty quickly in 10 years, which is how long Facebook's been going. And as well as the thousands of jobs within Facebook, we've helped to create hundreds of thousands of jobs around the world, both in creating, making some of the hardware that people use Facebook products on, but also in terms of many small and medium-sized businesses, and indeed large businesses, using our platform to reach new customers and to grow. People often will ask us, well, how can we create that kind of engineering company here in the UK? How can we create a Facebook? What is it about the conditions that Facebook, that Mark Zuckerberg and the other people who started our company, what were the conditions they had that enabled them to create this great engineering company? And how could we do something similar in the UK? What are the conditions we need in order for those kind of businesses to thrive? I guess I identified 3 things: skills, immigration, and a balance around the use of data. Let me just take each of those in turn. We're absolutely focused on skills today. Gavin suggested that perhaps there's been too much of a focus on coding. I think we barely started. We barely touched the the surface of what we need to do in the UK to skill for a new kind of digital, data-driven economy. And that's data-driven across every single sector. There isn't going to be a data-driven sector. Every sector will be data-driven. The recommendations in Maggie Philbin's Digital Skills for Tomorrow's World, we think are very impressive. They fit actually reasonably well with what's happening already in the education system, but we just need to ensure that we don't take our foot off the pedal here. As a company, we're supporting Apps for Good, who many of you may know, who work in now thousands of schools across the UK to help teachers with the right kind of course materials in order to encourage young people to come into our sector. And they can come into our sector, yes, as engineers, as coders, but also as people who are designers, people who are great marketeers, people who are really good at understanding consumer behaviour. The Apps for Good course helps to build all kinds of different types of skills. And we're very much with other companies in this sphere, and with, thankfully now, all the political parties in pushing for more young people to be taking their STEM subjects and to develop an interest in our sector. So skills is absolutely fundamental, and it was very much the skills base that Mark and colleagues were able to exploit in California that enabled our company to thrive. The second thing I'd focus on is immigration. Not necessarily a topic you'd expect us to cover here. We have to recognise that upskilling our workforce is going to take some time. And in the meantime, we've got enormous skill shortages in our sector. And therefore, on that basis, we need to enable companies to be able to recruit the workforces they need from the UK, from the EU, but also outside the EU. So an overly restrictive approach to immigration at this time when our digital and data-driven economy is growing would really hurt British industry and would restrict our ability to thrive. Then the third thing I'd emphasise is around the legal framework. So we tend to think of this being all about skills, but it's also about the ability of companies to innovate, to try new things. And the main way in which companies are innovating in this space is around the use of data. There's a lot of understandable concern about do people understand how their data is being used, how they can control it. We absolutely get that. But if an approach is taken by politicians, and unfortunately this is a debate which is mainly happening at European level, and a lot of domestic politicians are ignoring it. But if decisions made in that context over the next several months lead to an overly restrictive approach to how companies can use data, I fear, and we fear, that the ability of data-driven companies to innovate will be restricted. There'll be an incredibly prescriptive approach. There'll be requirements to employ certain kind of officers, whatever size company you are, if you're handling data. And that will actually limit some important innovations to come out around edtech, medtech, fintech, etc., which could harm British business. So we'd say focus on those three things: skills, immigration, and a balanced approach to laws around data.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm going to come to Jonathan now. An interesting moment for you to come in, Jonathan, because there's a bit of a tension between what we're hearing in a way about the need for changing the education system, but also the need to address the skills shortage now through immigration. I'm interested to see what you think Britain needs to do to be more competitive, and where we should be focusing.
So fortunately, because I'm not in the Home Affairs team, I don't get to talk about immigration policy. So I'm going to duck that one subtly. I just wanted to kind of, I guess, reflect on the sort of the broader political context here, because I thought what Gavin and what Simon talked about was really, really interesting, because essentially what they're talking about is the reintroduction of advanced manufacturing on a kind of small scale, but also obviously Facebook on a massive scale. And if you think back, it's actually relatively recently that the Labour Party, when in government, reaccustomed itself to a sort of industrial policy or a manufacturing policy. Obviously kind of sort of back in the sort of 70s and 80s, it was very much the vogue. Then there was a kind of complete agreement that was absolutely not the right way to go. And it was actually only under sort of Peter Mandelson under the last government, and when biz started to get back into kind of the industrial policy game, you had kind of new industries for new jobs, you kind of had a recognition that the government had a sort of slightly more organised role to play in the skills sector. And of course, what's even more interesting now is that the Conservative Party has now joined the Labour Party in that. So from having had, not that long ago, a three-party consensus that any form of organised skills policy or economic growth policy was completely the wrong thing to do. It was about picking winners, it was about, back in the 70s, it was about strikes, it was about British Leyland, it was, very much not the thing to do. We now have a three-party agreement that industrial policy is the thing to do. And of course we call it something different now, so it doesn't tend to be called sort of enterprise policy or economic growth, but it is more or less the same thing. And so when people like David Willetts, when he was the Universities and Science Minister, talked quite extensively about this kind of new industrial policy. He calls it picking races, not picking winners, which I do think is quite a nice phrase. And it's essentially recognising that, all right, we're not necessarily saying this company, this company, this company, but there is a cross-party agreement that if you look at certain sectors where UK PLCs are well placed, there is definitely a role for government in trying to support that. And the kind of the advanced manufacturing and digital-driven things that both Simon and Gavin talked about this morning are very, very much part of that. So I just wanted to kind of touch on a couple of things that I think that means, and in particular, focus on what it might mean for the Labour Party. So the first thing, I think, this room and this conversation is an example of what Ed Miliband means when he talks about race to the top. So when he spoke in his party conference speech last year about race to the top, and he contrasted it with the Tories' kind of race to the bottom, and he said, look, it's about growing a different type of economy, it's about being higher skilled, it's about greater cooperation. It's this type of thing which I think he's talking about. Because this is about recognising that there are sometimes small, sometimes big businesses, highly skilled, but need some form of greater government support in order to grow. And I think this is a really, really good example of the type of thing he talks about. And second reason why I think this is really big, kind of good Labour Party Ed Miliband territory is, again, I'm going to talk about devolution very, very briefly. It's not a topic that is going to be discussed at all the rest of the conference, so I thought I'd throw it in. But it is about, because of course skills has both a kind of sectoral agenda and a spatial agenda. And there's always been a little bit of a tension. When we talk about the skills agenda, are we really thinking about skills for a sector? So are we thinking about digital skills or creative skills? Or are we really thinking about skills from a kind of spatial place? Are we interested, sitting here in Manchester, about the particular sectors that Manchester's strong in? Or are we interested in Manchester as a place? And I think this government and the last government has started to move a bit more towards a kind of spatial strategy. So we are interested in Manchester as a local economic hub. Manchester is actually kind of one of the best examples in the UK of actually kind of good regionally driven growth. So Manchester is an incredibly booming economy. It's got a number of very, very large companies here, doing very, very well in terms of cooperation between the local city council, the FE colleges, the universities, something like 50,000 students in Manchester. It's a really, really good example of when you do bring all of these things together, you can actually start to see some things happening effectively. Now, I'm slightly nervous that the devolution agenda will take something like Manchester and attempt to replicate it elsewhere. So just as there's nervousness wider in education policy about kind of cherry picking from international places, so you go to the Labour Party conference and you talk about Finland, you go to the Tory Party conference and you talk about Singapore, and the answer is none of those really apply to England. I get nervous that we will take Manchester and apply it elsewhere. So just as London has a certain set of particular advantages which make it quite tech heavy, Manchester also has a certain particular set of advantages. And some of those are quite nebulous, and they're to do with sort of a sense of place, they're to do with the fact that they've got three very, very high class universities here which keep a large number of graduates in the region. It's got a very, very effective city council. These are not things which are necessarily replicated everywhere else. And I think the danger of kind of putting skills into the devolution agenda and saying, look, why don't we just look to try and grow here east type approach, very, very successfully working in London, in Sheffield or in Newcastle or in Leeds or in the Black Country or wherever you may pick. I get a little bit nervous about some of those things. Nothing wrong with the Black Country engine, but more generally, I get a little bit kind of nervous about that. And then I think the third element that I think is interesting is we need to be much, much clearer about what skills means. And there's a danger that when we talk about skills policy, that we just think it's basically about apprenticeships and about the growth of FE. But I think the conversation this morning has been really, really interesting because, of course, it goes much, much wider than that. So if we are talking about how we grow, and if we are talking about a workforce that allows us for economic growth, it's not just about apprenticeships or about FE colleges. It's about, as the previous speakers have said, the ability to have power generation, the ability to have a highly skilled workforce, issues to do with migration, issues to do with housing, issues to do with transport. Policy Exchange put out a report quite recently about how we can help rebalance the economy. The average rail speed between our major northern cities and London is 77 miles an hour. the average rail speed between northern cities is 46 miles an hour. So if you live in Manchester, or in Leeds, or in Sheffield, or in Newcastle, it's quicker for you to get to London than it is for you to get between those two cities. And it's practical things like that which are really, really important to address if you're thinking about skills and you're thinking about rebalancing. Of course we need to grow apprenticeships, of course you need to have a more highly skilled workforce, but you need to think about this in a really kind of linked up way, to use that horrible phrase, because it is much more than just ensuring we've got high quality apprenticeships. So from the Labour Party's agenda, looking to address all of these issues, I think is really, really fruitful territory. I think they are very, very interested in this agenda, and I would urge them to look at this agenda with the one note of caution that can we not rush too quickly to a sort of spatial skills strategy, because I suspect if we do that, we'll be sitting here in 5 years' time talking about needing to unpick that a little bit more.
No caution there. And finally, Andy, we've kind of broadened this out really to even infrastructure, rail speeds, and quite rightly, but coming back to education and actually creating people's skills. I know at Sky we employ about 3,000 tech people and struggle consistently to actually get staff with the right skills, graduating from university, especially women, to come and do the jobs we need them to do. What is going on in higher education, and what do you think needs to be done?
Sort it out.
Yeah.
Okay, the
In
good
5
going
minutes.
last of these panels is that you kind of see all your points disappear as everyone speaks. And I was doing quite well until Jonathan started. I was thinking, yeah, I'll do a bit on industrial policy, I'll do a bit on supply side skills, and finish with a bit of higher education. So I won't do that. If it wasn't like I'd have tear it up and throw it away. I'll get to the HE bit in a minute. I think one thing nobody's mentioned, the only thing nobody's mentioned, and given that Ed Balls is speaking later, is kind of basically the last, and it is what Jonathan talked about, the last sort of 30 years, you know, Labour's version of kind of, you know, supply side economics was the kind of, you know, post-neoliberal, neo-endogenous, or was it neo-post-liberal? Anyway, some combination of all of those four things. And the skills system, and by that I would call it the school system, the FE system, and the HE system, all sat very comfortably in that place. Because it was about racking up skills and supplying it to a labour market where a government didn't really want to interfere too much in the labour market, spatially, sectorally, in any way at all. And in truth, you know, all three bits of the education system still exist in that space. So we did have this kind of small hiccup towards the end of the Labour government when at least three of us were working on things like new industries, new jobs. Where, you know, there was the issue of a kind of, you know, a major recession, an election kind of coming up, and the need for a better story than this kind of, you know, just let the market do its thing and everything will be fine. And, you know, out of that, both Peter Mandelson and John Denham kind of spotted this need for a more activist approach. So industrial activism, which was the phrase that wasn't industrial policy, but very nearly. Kind of made its bow, and up until that point, the only time we talked about manufacturing, it was a kind of, you know, ministers would make the speech, and routinely they'd say, of course we take manufacturing very seriously. We're the 5th biggest manufacturing economy in the world, and then a couple of years later we'd say, of course we take manufacturing seriously. We're the 6th biggest manufacturing country in the world. Now you listen to ministers, and we're about 7th or 8th. So you know, manufacturing is clearly part of that. Jonathan's right, and you know, and other members of the panel are right to say that you know, the language has changed. New industries, new jobs came along. Industrial strategy, industrial policy is now kind of, it's okay to say those words. We spent a long time in the last government trying to think of alternatives to that phrase. Ken Clarke, in the run-up to the election, said you know, the phrase industrial policy sent shivers down his spine. You know, fast forward 4 years. Vince Cable, David Willits, as well as kind of Ed Miliband and Chuka, talk about it all the time. So that's, I think that's all a very good thing, because it is about the demand side. It is about the demand side. What this isn't about anymore is just supplying more skills into the economy kind of willy-nilly and hoping they get used. One of the things we looked into when we were in government was the kind of, you know, the amount of STEM skills that kind of got produced and the amount that got used in the economy. And basically, kind of 1 in 4 STEM graduates worked in STEM. So there's no guarantee as a kind of consequence. So, you know, I'm all for expanding the supply of STEM, but there's no guarantee that you'll get them all into either Facebook or kind of, you know, digital industries or kind of engineering industries that require them. So that's a kind of that's a sort of big issue for us. I mean, I think the two challenges we face, and I'll just to be quick, one is scale. So we've rediscovered industrial policy, but we still kind of piddle about with it in terms of the sort of size of our inspections. So I was talking to Adrian before, and we were fondly remembering when Peter Mandelson got his ninja budget from the Treasury, as we called it. He loved the phrase ninja, because he could sort of see himself. It was 750 million quid, and he lent a bit of that to Sheffield Forge Masters. But it was tiny compared to what we spend on the education system, on the research budget, on all sorts of other kind of government kind of spaces. So scale is an issue. There might be consensus on language, but there isn't consensus on scale. If we're really going to kind of intervene, we need to kind of think about, how we can put some serious oomph behind that. And my sort of second and final point from that is that actually that automatically takes us to a different place, certainly for FE and HE, which is a kind of, a mindset that is more about the demand side than the supply side. It's no longer enough just to keep supplying more and more, and I'm all for more and more. All for more and more graduates, and I'm all for more and more kind of apprentices, and more STEM skills. But that in itself is not enough. What we need is a much more kind of demand-orientated mindset, whether that's organised regionally or locally. And it's interesting with the devolution conversation, the kind of industrial policy is actually much larger at the local level. So in Manchester, no one's mentioned graphene yet. So I won't. But the notion that kind of you would make a kind of serious intervention to support things like that at a kind of local and sectoral level is quite interesting. But within that and at the heart of that, both policy and institutions need to think about the demand side much more than they have over the last 30 years. And I think unless we get to that space, we will be here in 5 years. I have been here for the last kind of 5-year period, kind of talking about skills, so I confidently expect I will be again, but hopefully we'll be talking about it in a different way.
Thank you very much. Right, lots of material to debate now from everyone. I'm going to slip in a cheeky question of my own before I open it up, which is, more a theme that I hope you will address when you answer the other questions. But and I think that I should say probably there is a consensus about a demand-driven approach to this from industry, from the sector, but how can we make sure that it helps people at the bottom of society? How confident are we that if the visions that we've heard on this panel are to manifest, that it will create more opportunity for people who traditionally have not had opportunity? Is that something that we can assume will happen automatically, or do we need specific policy to make sure there's inclusion in this upskilling feature? So I won't ask you to answer that now, but if you could address it, I would be grateful. And now I will open up to questions from the floor. I'll take, one at a time for now. Yeah, so and if you could start by introducing yourself, please.
Hi, so I'm Sarah. I work in corporate affairs at Microsoft, focus on youth and skills. There was something that came across in a number of the conversations that seemed to be a bit of an either-or. So an either-or academic versus vocational, and an either-or advanced engineering versus digital. I'd just like people to talk whether it really needs to be either-or.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll just take one more question and then if we can answer both.
Thanks. Tom Stanhope from NICE. We're the National Organisation for Adult Learning and Adult Skills, and supported Adrian's committee's recent inquiry on adult literacy and numeracy particularly. And it's related to your point, I think, about the trickle down or otherwise. And I think particularly interested, Jonathan, in your comments about the need for this to be spatial as well as sectoral, because a big part of the issue about addressing the spatial skills gap has to be about recognising the lack of basic skills, not just on literacy and numeracy, but also on digital across the adult population in the UK. And that doesn't just mean fancy adult education courses for middle-class people in their mid-50s, but it does mean everybody over the age of 16 and all of the different entry routes into the system, whether that's through FE, HE or otherwise. And I think those basic skills deficits are a massive part of what's holding back economic growth. And we already know in terms of the supply projections that there will not be enough young people coming in to fill the jobs gap that the economy needs to recover. So adult skills and plugging the adult skills gap has to be a very, very big part of that spatial definition. And as we know, it's very, very different locality to locality. So I'd be very interested in Pal's comments on that.
Thank you very much. Just answer those if we take any more questions. Can I start with you, Adrian?
Yes, first of all, Sarah's question. I hope my remarks didn't convey the impression that I thought it was either or. In fact, quite the opposite was what I'm trying to get at. If you can have and I come back to the horrible phrase, a local educational ecosystem, by which I mean maybe the local universities working with local businesses and them both working in a triangular system with the local schools, you can develop an approach by which some students might want to just go the academic route, but other students who may actually want to get higher education qualifications ultimately can see the advantages of doing it via business and then going on to university or taking advantage of the various structures and opportunities for them to get qualifications as mature students. And I do think that given the current funding regime, there is actually a compelling economic advantage that at the moment is not being totally exploited by the business community. But a further consideration that we're actually doing an inquiry into this at the moment is that universities themselves have a potentially crucial role in both regional economic development and maintaining the competitive advantage that we have in high value-added manufacturing and other business areas. We are world leaders at universities. There is a huge demand, and I totally agree with the speaker who talked about immigration and visa regimes. It is a major industry in itself, our universities. And at the moment, some are working very effectively with local businesses and developing the local economy. But I believe that a more regionally focused regional policy incorporating universities could actually really move this forward at a huge rate. And those universities, not only working with business, but working with schools, can, if you like, incentivize and draw and change young people's perceptions of what are the necessary qualifications to get on in life. And by doing that, the distinction between academic and business and vocation and so on becomes blurred, and I think quite legitimately people in local areas, once they've got relatives and so on who've been through this route, will look upon vocational as of higher status and more likely to use it. That's a slightly rambling explanation, but there are some instances of very good practice taking place, but they're by no means standard and they're by no means adequately underpinned by a government policy. The adult skills, I totally agree, and thank you for your support when the committee went to Leicester. Again, it comes back to my opening thesis that the current educational system fails a substantial number of people, and there has to be a greater prioritisation between different departments working together to address the issues that arise from the very significant number of people who've got inadequate skills and who need them, not just for themselves, but because the economy needs them as well. And that involves a multiplicity of well, first of all, it needs it made higher priority by the government. Secondly, it needs more interdepartmental working to focus on it. And thirdly, it means that actually teaching adult skills, teaching people who are, if you like, from social backgrounds that don't encourage education, those people should have higher status and more support from the government.
And will Labour commit to doing something about that?
I come back to my own opening. Shall we say, my report will reinforce the argument for it.
Right, Simon, interested in your thoughts on whether we've been presenting a false dichotomy here, and also what you think about adults plugging the gap in adult skills.
Yeah, some really interesting areas here. I think there is a danger that there's an overemphasis on the digital making end of the skills spectrum, as set out in Maggie Philbin's report, and that we neglect the fact that there are sort of several million adults in the UK who have never been online. And therefore it is important that we have a spectrum of, I'd say, policies, but also frankly organisations who are supported to address each of the different areas of skills deficit. Afra mentioned earlier, I'm on the board of the Tinder Foundation, which has nothing to do with the dating app. It felt like a great name. The Tinder Foundation supports a network of UK online centres all across the UK that are helping people get online for the very first time. And I think it would be a terrible shame if, by focusing at the digital making end of the spectrum, and particularly on young people, that we left that group of people behind. So I'm very supportive of, and indeed as a company, we're supportive of ensuring we get a balanced approach right across the skills spectrum. But I certainly don't think this is a zero-sum game. It doesn't mean that we can't do all of that. We absolutely can, given the size of the opportunity for the company.
Jonathan, would you like to?
Yeah, just very briefly on Tom's point about spatial and also your point, Afra, about kind of what this means for the lower skill. So one of the really interesting things is if you look at the geographical space within which people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, live their lives. So if you look traditionally at people that don't even have a level 2 qualification or struggle to get a level 2 qualification, GCSE equivalent, very typically they will be born, be educated, live, work within a pretty small geographical area. And to that extent, a focus on that skills type of approach should largely be a spatial strategy. If you grow up in Leicestershire and you leave school and don't really get a level 2 qualification, you will probably, for most of your life, live in and around Leicestershire. And therefore, any approach that doesn't focus on Leicestershire as a place for economy is not really going to affect you. By contrast, if you look at university graduates, particularly Russell Group university graduates, very, very large numbers of them commute a large distance to that university and then crucially leave afterwards. So again, Manchester is one of the exceptions in that it does retain a relatively large number of its graduates. If you plot the geographic movement of Russell Group graduates to and from London in particular after graduation, you just see this massive sucking effect. And again, Policy Exchange did some work on this. One of the difficulties when you're trying to rebalance the economy is you have very, very high-class universities where you have graduates who are effectively developing businesses, and two things happen. One is the university holds the IP, so it's quite difficult for you to make any money out of it as a business, particularly a tech business. And the second thing that happens is they all leave the university, they all come down to London. And Cambridge is almost, Manchester are almost the only exceptions, because Cambridge has its own kind of tech cluster, and Manchester has a kind of enough of an economy to keep people there. But most people will suck out there. So for them, a spatial strategy is kind of less relevant. So when you're thinking about what kind of approach do you need to take that encompasses the lower paid and lower skilled, I'd say two things. One is that you do need to be more spatial, and you do need to think about local infrastructure and ecosystems. And the second thing I throw into the mix here is about lifelong learning, and it's about recognising, at the moment, if you want to do a qualification, more or less the state pays for you the first time around. If you go to an FE college and you want a level 2 or level 3 qualification, the state will pay for you, more or less. You might have to take out a loan, but for argument's sake, simplicity's sake, the state pays for you. If you then want to do a higher qualification, the state will get paid. If you want to do the same level qualification, you don't get paid, because the argument is that the state should only focus on upskilling. But what that means is if you take an example of, let's say, somebody who's about 40 years old, who's worked in manufacturing, and through no fault of their own, essentially that industry has died, and he or she wants to retrain and go back to college and do all of the things which government policy says, you're stuck, because you can't do the same qualification again. you have to either get your employer to pay for it or you have to pay for it. And there are various practical reasons why that doesn't quite happen. So in that instance, one of the things I think is really interesting is, should we in certain limited instances pay for somebody to retrain at the same level? And that I think is quite an interesting way of support lifelong learning and support people at kind of the lower skill end. If you've got a level 2 qualification, but it's in an irrelevant industry and you want a different one 20 years later, I think the state should pay for that.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really interesting. Just picking up on your points about spatial strategies, I want to bring Gavin in because this is a very spatial project, and I used to live in that part of East London. I know there are incredible levels of poverty, and I'm just interested as to whether it feels as if Here East is going to be able to impact positively some of the lower skilled people in that area, or at the moment whether it feels like something that's kind of being put on top of the existing community.
At the moment it feels like it's something which is just landed in this part of East London, but then it has done for the last 10 years because it's post-Olympics, the whole build-up and then the Games in 2012. But our role, and it's interesting, you know, here I am back within a think tank environment and a political conference, talking about government policy, but actually what we're trying to do as a business is to do our own policy, reflect on everything we're hearing and exploit what is going on in government, saying, look, we need to make sure that whatever we build on the Olympic Park and take it to the next exploit will be part of tentacles right across East London. Our remit for Legacy was the Olympic Coast Boroughs, so the 4 Olympic boroughs surrounding the park, but we recognise that it doesn't stop at those boundaries. And one of the things, the benefits of having a think tank background is, you know, these issues do cross borough boundaries. They're not just as some politicians, local government agencies will think it's only within my area, in my sphere. So what we're doing is making sure that A, we promote education programs, enterprise programs, and make sure that our tenants who come in support that as well. We have some very strange lease documents, agreement for lease documents, where we can't compel, but we promote and we ask the tenants who are coming to Here East to participate in the programs we're putting in place. And they see that very rewarding. As an example, our first tenant is already operating. We now have to build around a live TV studio, which is fun. So BT Sport, absolutely the basis. They have 24 edit suites and sound overlay studios, which pretty much lie with London from 8 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, until they kick in ready for their afternoon and evening broadcast. So what they're doing is opening up their edit suites to the local community who are running digital broadcast courses to bring in students, to support the lecturers by having their sound engineers alongside, and get the students real live training on state-of-the-art equipment by opening up their facilities. And as we build out and as we take more and more tenants, that's the type of approach we want to see in Here East. And also to work in schools, so from a very early age. So the youngsters who are growing up in that area see what we're doing, which is pretty space-age looking design, admittedly, in this part of the world, but they feel comfortable coming to Here East. So we run programs with our tenants out in the schools, but also the schools themselves end up coming to Here East. We've got a multitude of event spaces. We've got a theatre with 1,000 people. It's actually, this is a place they are able to come to, feel comfortable coming to, and ultimately will have access into jobs and sectors which they may not have access to through the informal networks which operate in the life amongst the sectors we're dealing with, but they're already inbuilt into those schools. So ultimately, when it's time to find work, they can come to Here East and they can find work in some of our organisations we've got with us. But even better, because of the enterprise programs we want to run, if they want to start a job, they start a company, start a business, and create further jobs, then come to Here East as well. So this is why I said right at the beginning, it's nice to finish on the ecosystem, the localised ecosystems. That is what we're trying to achieve. And through doing that, it's opened up this entire network across the country, which we see is really, really important as well.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to finish now. Time is escaping us, but I think it's good to finish on a positive note. And I think what's come out of today is that although we have some quite formidable challenges, we also have an opportunity to be really creative. And I think that came across from our panel. There are lots of ways that we can think differently and do things differently. So Adrian, it's good to have you here, and I hope, and I'm sure everyone here hopes, that some of these ideas will take root should you be back in government.
I will do my best.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Thank you for our panel.